The first cruelty of the evening was meant to be quiet, but Wren Ashford heard every word of it. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the two women behind the potted orange trees the satisfaction of a blush, though her ears burned as if someone had held a candle too near them. Harwick Grange, in the county of Wexmoor. In the spring of a year the neighborhood would later remember only for its scandalous weather and its scandalous gossip in equal measure, wore its candlelight that night like borrowed jewelry, glittering hard and fast before midnight could think to ask for it back, and the ballroom breathed in silk and hothouse lilies and the particular self-satisfaction of a county that believed itself, for one evening, the whole of the civilized world. The great room had been built for people to be seen in, and Wren stood in the one corner of it built for people to be overlooked, beside the dowager's hard-backed chairs, near enough to the draught from the terrace doors that she had learned, over 3 years, exactly how to angle her shoulders against it, without appearing to notice the cold at all. No one asked her to dance. No one expected anyone to ask her to dance. She was, as her aunt liked to phrase it to new acquaintances with a gentle, regretful little laugh, a young woman of reduced circumstances living now on the family's charity, and charity, Wren had learned, was a word people enjoyed saying a great deal more than they enjoyed practicing. Charity. It was a single syllable dressed up as 3, and it was pinned to her the way other women pinned diamonds, worn everywhere, catching the light whether she wished it to or not. At her throat that evening, fastened crookedly, because she had fastened it alone in the dark, rather than trouble a maid who had better things to do than dress a poor relation, sat a small tin wren no larger than a shilling, its painted wings chipped down to gray metal at the tips, a mother's idea of a jewel, and the only ornament in the whole glittering room that anyone might reasonably have called plain. It had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, and it was worth, in the strict accounting of the county's jewelers, almost nothing at all, which was precisely why Wren had never once considered leaving it in a drawer. Across the room, under 6 branches of candlelight arranged to flatter exactly one woman, her cousin Seraphina Harwick turned in a slow circle so that the gown might be admired from every angle. And the gown deserved admiring, because Wren had spent 11 weeks of her life making it deserve exactly that. She had drawn the pattern herself, hedgerow and hawthorn worked in silver thread along the hem, so that it seemed, in candlelight, to be dusted with frost though the room was warm as a kitchen, and along the inside seam, low enough that only a lady's maid or a sister might ever find it, she had stitched a single small wren, wings spread, because she had never yet finished a piece of work without leaving that quiet, unglamorous signature somewhere no one but herself would think to look. No one was looking. That, too, was familiar. Seraphina's laugh rang out bright and easy as she accepted a compliment on the needlework from a baronet's wife, and said, with the particular sweetness of someone who has told a lie so many times it has begun to feel like memory, that she had worked every stitch herself through the long winter evenings entirely alone for the pleasure of it. The baronet's wife pressed a gloved hand to her heart and declared it the finest handiwork she had seen since her own girlhood, and 3 other women drifted closer to agree, and not one of them so much as glanced toward the corner by the terrace doors, where the hands that had actually done the work were folded, still and correct, in a lap the color of old rainwater. It is a settled thing in every drawing room in every county that credit travels uphill, the way water is drawn to low ground by nothing but the shape of the land, and no one troubles to ask the water whether it consents to the arrangement. Wren did not correct her cousin. She had learned, 3 winters ago, exactly what correcting Seraphina cost, and the lesson had not required repeating. She could have said, in that moment, that the hawthorn pattern along the hem had come from a sketch she had made of the Grange's own hedge in October frost, 3 years before Serafina had ever expressed an interest in embroidery at all. She could have said that Serafina's hands, soft and unpricked, had never in their life held a needle for longer than it took to be photographed doing so for a family portrait. She could have said a great many devastating, entirely true things, and she said none of them, because saying them would not have made the gown hers again in any way that mattered. And because a woman who eats another family's bread learns quickly that the truth is a luxury priced well beyond her means. She only smiled, the small, correct, unreadable smile she had practiced until it no longer cost her anything visible, and when Lady Pharaoh, sweeping past with a glass of ratafia and an audience of 2 unmarried daughters trailing in her wake, paused to ask, in a voice pitched exactly to Carrie, whether dear Wren oughtn't to have something new made up for herself one of these seasons. It really was such a shame to see the same gray wool 3 years running. Was everything quite all right at home? There had been such stories. Wren answered that she was very content, and that gray wool wore so much better than silk, and that she was grateful, always, for her aunt's kindness in clothing her at all. The words sounded modest. The intention beneath them was a blade turned sideways and slid in without a sound, because everyone in earshot understood, as Wren understood, that a household of Sir Aldous Harwick's standing did not clothe its own kin in 3-year-old wool unless it wished the neighborhood to know precisely how little that kin was worth to it. It was not a question Lady Pharaoh had asked. It was a verdict, dressed as concern, delivered for the benefit of the 2 unmarried daughters, who were meant to learn from it exactly what became of young women without fortune or family influence of their own. And the small ripple of laughter that followed, not cruel laughter, nothing so honest as that, only the soft, indulgent laughter reserved for a woman clever enough to wound without ever raising her voice, was not universal. It did not need to be. Enough of the room had heard. Wren's aunt, Constance Harwick, arrived at her elbow a moment later with the particular warmth she reserved for public places, and slid an arm through Wren's and said, to no one and to everyone, that her dear niece was such a comfort to her, so undemanding, so very easy to have about the house, before adding, in the same breath and the same fond tone, that of course a girl in Wren's position could hardly expect the sort of season her own daughter enjoyed, and wasn't it a mercy Wren had never been the sort to want for much? It was affection with a hook baited into the center of it, the kind that only family could bait so cleanly, because only family knew precisely where the soft tissue lay. Wren agreed that it was a mercy. She had learned to agree with almost anything said pleasantly enough, because agreement was the fastest road back to invisibility, and invisibility in that ballroom was the closest thing to safety she possessed. There is a particular arithmetic practiced in rooms like that one, unspoken but universally understood, in which a person without land, without a settled fortune, without a father living to speak for her, is assumed to have forfeited any claim to being noticed at all, and merit, however real, however patiently built stitch by stitch through 11 weeks of candlelit evenings, is not accepted as currency in that economy. It buys nothing. It is, at best, tolerated, the way one tolerates rain on a day one had not planned to go out. And yet a thing happened that evening that had not happened at any of the dozen balls before it. Across the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the dark lawn, a man who had arrived late and greeted almost no one turned his head, very slightly, toward the corner by the terrace doors. He had been announced an hour earlier in the flat, unadorned tone the Grange's aging butler reserved for guests whose consequence required no embellishment. His Grace, the Duke of Alderley. The name had moved through the ballroom like a current through water, invisible but felt everywhere at once, chairs straightening, conversations thinning to polite murmurs, 3 separate mothers repositioning their daughters within his likely line of sight, with the unhurried efficiency of women who had done this particular maneuver many times before. Julian Vane, 7th Duke of Alderley, was known in Wexmoor and considerably beyond it as a man of exacting standards and very little patience for the performances that standing usually required of him, a man whose estate ran with the precision of a well-kept clock and whose voice, when he troubled to raise it at all, was reported to have ended more than one promising career among his own stewards. He was not known for warmth. He was known, if anything, for its opposite, for a stillness that unsettled people more than temper would have, for eyes that gave away nothing and were said, by those who claimed to know, to have given away considerably less since the death of the young Duchess some years before, a subject the county discussed only in the safety of its own drawing rooms and never once in his hearing. He had not danced. He had accepted a glass of wine he did not appear to be drinking, and had spent the better part of an hour in unhurried, unrevealing conversation with his host, and if he had noticed the small performance taking place near the terrace doors, the gown, the compliments, the laughter that was not universal, he had given no sign of it at all until the exact moment Lady Farrow's voice, pitched to Carrie, asked whether everything was quite all right at home. It was then, and only then, that his gaze crossed the room and found the corner where a plain gray wool dress and a chipped tin brooch stood very straight and very still among the silk. He said nothing. He did not cross the floor, did not offer so much as a nod that anyone else might have noticed, and yet something in the quality of his attention was different from the idle, cataloging glances the rest of the room threw her way, different enough that Wren felt it land somewhere beneath her collarbone like a hand set briefly and deliberately against a bruise, testing whether it still hurt. It was not admiration, not yet, and it was certainly not sympathy, which she would have refused in any case, being the sort of woman who had learned to distrust sympathy the way some people distrust flattery, for the same good reason. It was something closer to recognition, the particular attention a craftsman gives a piece of work whose maker he suspects has been misidentified. His eyes moved, briefly, to the hem of Seraphina's gown, to the hawthorn pattern catching the candlelight, and then back to the corner by the terrace doors, and something in his expression, not warmth, nothing so generous as warmth, only the faintest narrowing of unreadable attention, suggested he had done a small private sum in his head and arrived at an answer that did not match the one the room had been given. He said something quietly to his host, too low for anyone but the two of them to hear, and his host laughed, a short, surprised sound, and glanced across at Seraphina with an expression Wren could not read from that distance, and then the Duke turned the conversation elsewhere, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to closing subjects he had no wish to reopen. That was all. It was nothing in the accounting of the evening, no declaration, no gallant intervention, nothing a single other guest in that crowded room would have thought worth repeating over breakfast the next morning. But Wren, who had spent 3 years learning to read rooms the way other women read novels, understood that she had just been seen for the first time in longer than she cared to count. Seen not as the poor cousin, not as an act of charity given shelter out of Christian obligation, but as a person who had made a thing of beauty with her own 2 hands, and had it taken from her without a word of protest, and the strangeness of being seen at all, after so long being merely present, moved through her like a held breath she had not known she was holding. No thunder cracked over Harwick Grange that night. No candle guttered dramatically in protest, no music stopped to mark the moment, no one else in the room so much as paused. The quartet simply finished one dance and began the next, and Lady Pharaoh moved on to a fresh audience, and Seraphina accepted another compliment with the same soft, practiced laugh, and the room turned its collective shoulder and forgot the corner by the terrace doors entirely, the way rooms full of comfortable people always do forget the ones standing at their edges, because comfort has never once in its history required memory. Ren's mother had died when Ren was 11 years old, quietly, of a wasting fever that took 8 weeks to finish what it started, and in the last of those weeks, when speech had become a labor too costly to spend on anything but what mattered most, she had pinned the small tin wren to her daughter's collar with hands that had gone thin and papery and still impossibly steady, and said the thing she had said perhaps 100 times before in better health, but never with such weight behind it. "A wren need not be a peacock," she had said, her voice barely more than the shape of breath. "Her song is no less true for being sung softly." Ren could still, 9 years later, call up the exact sensation of that afternoon, whenever the tin brooch grew warm against her skin. The smell of beeswax and the lavender her mother kept folded into every drawer, the rasp of a wool blanket against her own child's wrist, the particular hush of a sick room in late afternoon light, and beneath all of it her mother's voice, unhurried even in dying, delivering the one lesson she had apparently judged most urgent to leave behind. Her father had followed 4 years later, not from illness, but from a fall from a horse he had ridden 100 times before without incident, the kind of death the county called a tragedy, and quietly, privately, called an inconvenience. Because it left a 15-year-old girl with no fortune, no land, and no living relation closer than her mother's sister, Constance, who had married considerably above her own modest origins and had spent every year since working to make certain no one in Wexmore remembered it. Constance Harwick had taken her sister's orphaned daughter in without a moment's public hesitation, and had been thanked for it at every dinner party for 3 years running, and the arrangement suited her very well indeed, because a niece of good breeding and quiet, exhausted gratitude made an excellent unpaid companion, an excellent unpaid seamstress, an excellent unpaid audience for a daughter whose own talents required, it turned out, considerable outside assistance to shine as brightly as her mother wished the county to believe they shone unaided. Ren mended. Ren embroidered. Ren sat up past midnight, finishing hymns by candlelight while Seraphina slept, and rose before the rest of the household to see to whatever small domestic crisis had presented itself overnight, and in exchange she received a roof, a bed in the least favored corner of the house, 3 gray wool dresses in strict rotation, and the frequent, warmly delivered reminder that she ought to be grateful. That girls in her position so rarely landed anywhere half so comfortable, that charity, once accepted, obliged a certain permanent and cheerful humility in the one who had accepted it. It is a peculiar cruelty, dressed up as kindness, to give a person shelter, and then spend that shelter as leverage for the rest of her natural life. And Ren had come, over 3 years, to recognize the shape of it exactly, the way one learns to recognize the outline of a familiar bruise beneath a sleeve, even after the color has faded. She rose the following morning before the rest of the household stirred, as she always did, and went down to the kitchen garden while the dew was still silver on the cabbages. Because the one corner of Harwick Grange that had ever felt entirely hers was the strip of ground behind the kitchen wall that no one else troubled to look at, where she had spent 3 years coaxing a stubborn, unpromising bed of soil into something that bordered, in June, on beautiful. She had a gift for growing things that no one in the house had ever thought to remark upon, chiefly because no one in the house ever walked as far as the kitchen garden, and she had a gift, too, for mending what was broken quietly enough that no one noticed it had ever been broken at all. a torn hem repaired before a guest woke to find it. A servant's quarrel smoothed over before it reached her aunt's ears. A feverish kitchen boy dosed with the willow bark tea her mother had taught her to make before anyone thought to send for a physician who would have charged the household 2 guineas for the same advice. No one saw. That, too, was familiar, and she had stopped, mostly, expecting it to be otherwise. It is a settled truth of certain households that competence unaccompanied by consequence is simply absorbed, like water into dry ground, leaving no visible trace of where it went, and Wren had made a private peace, or something she called a peace for lack of a better word, with being the ground rather than the rain. By the following evening, the incident of the gown had already been folded neatly into the general fabric of the county's gossip, repeated over card tables and morning calls as a charming anecdote about Miss Harwick's hidden talents, and Wren heard it retold at least 3 times before the week was out. Each time with a little more warmth toward Seraphina and a little less curiosity about anyone else's hands, and each time she said nothing, and each time the not saying cost her something small that she did not trouble to name even to herself. It was Lady Farrow who brought the second blow, 10 days later, at a modest afternoon gathering held in the Harwicks' own drawing room, ostensibly to celebrate the fine weather, and, in practice, to allow the ladies of the neighborhood to inspect one another's spring wardrobes at close range. A ring went missing from a side table where Lady Farrow had set it down to take tea, a small garnet thing, not especially valuable, but hers, and its absence was noted within the half hour with an alarm that seemed, even at the time, disproportionate to its worth. It was Seraphina who suggested, in a voice pitched with theatrical reluctance, that perhaps someone ought to check the servants' hall, and it was Constance who added, gently, that of course one hated to think it of anyone in the household, but that Wren had been alone in the drawing room not 20 minutes before, tidying the tea things. And surely no one meant any accusation by simply mentioning the fact. No one meant any accusation. The words were arranged with such careful, deniable innocence that they could not be answered without seeming to protest too much, and Wren felt the room's attention swing toward her, the way a flock of birds turns as one body in flight, no single bird choosing the direction, the whole simply moving because the whole had decided. She had not taken the ring. She had, in fact, seen it slide from the table's edge into the folds of the tea-cloth when Lady Farrow set down her cup too quickly, and she said so, plainly, and retrieved it from beneath the cloth in front of 6 witnesses within the space of a minute, and the ring was restored to Lady Farrow's finger with a small, flustered laugh and an offhand remark about how careless one becomes in one's own home, as if the accusation had never been spoken aloud at all. No apology followed. None was expected to follow, and none did, because apologies, like credit, traveled uphill in that particular economy, and a girl living on charity was not owed the courtesy of having a false accusation formally withdrawn, only the relief of having it quietly, wordlessly dropped, once it proved inconvenient to pursue. Wren excused herself a few minutes later to see to the tea things again, and stood for a moment alone in the small pantry off the kitchen, with her back against the cool stone wall and her hand pressed, without her quite deciding to press it there, against the small tin wren at her collar, and did not cry, because crying, she had learned, accomplished nothing beyond leaving a person red-eyed and further exposed, and because there was no melodrama available to her even if she had wanted it, no swoon, no scene, no sympathetic hand offered by anyone who mattered, only the small, private, unwitnessed fact of standing in a pantry with her pulse loud in her ears while beyond the door. The drawing room's laughter resumed exactly as though nothing at all had happened in it. The world, it turned out, required remarkably little to forgive itself and move on. It was 3 days later, on an errand to the village to collect a parcel of thread her aunt had ordered and had no intention of paying full price for if a lesser errand runner might negotiate it down, that Wren first encountered the Duke of Alderley at close enough range to exchange words with him, and the encounter began, as so many of the significant moments of her life had begun, with someone else's carelessness. A farm cart had lost a wheel at the crossroads just past the village green, spilling a crate of chickens directly into the lane. And in the general confusion of squawking and shouting and a young carter close to tears over the ruin of his morning, Wren had simply set down her parcel and gone to work, because it had never in her life occurred to her to stand by and watch a problem when her hands might be useful to it instead. She caught 2 birds before anyone else had thought to try, calmed a third that had wedged itself half-panicked beneath the cart's broken axle by the simple, unglamorous method of talking to it in the low, steady voice she used on frightened things generally, and had the whole business more than half resolved by the time a tall man in a plain dark greatcoat dismounted from a horse she had not heard approach, crouched down without a word and began methodically righting the crate itself, his hands, she noticed, entirely unbothered by feathers or mud, entirely competent, the hands of a man used to doing things himself rather than watching them be done. They did not speak until the last chicken was secured, and the carter, red-faced with gratitude, had been sent on his way with assurances that the wheel would be seen to from the Alderley estate's own smithy at no charge to him whatsoever. It was only then, straightening, that the man in the greatcoat looked properly at her for the first time, and Wren realized, with a small internal drop of recognition, exactly who she was standing in a muddy village lane with. He did not apologize for the mud on his hands, nor comment on the state of hers. He said only that it was well done, in a voice that matched everything the county said of him, quiet, dry, entirely without ornament. The sort of voice that never needed to rise because it had never in his life needed to compete for a room's attention, and Wren, brushing feathers from her sleeve, replied that the chickens deserved most of the credit since they had done the running and she had merely done the catching. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, gone before it could properly be called one, and he said that in his experience credit rarely went to whoever had actually done the running, and there was a weight beneath the words that made it plain, to Wren at least, that he was not speaking only of chickens. She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, which was, as ever, her safest reply, and he did not press her to say more, only inclined his head with the exact correct degree of courtesy owed a gentlewoman met by chance in a lane, and remounted, and rode on toward Alderley without another word, leaving her standing in the churned mud with her parcel of thread and the distinct, unsettling sense of having been looked at properly for the second time in a fortnight by the same unreadable pair of eyes. It is not admiration, a wiser and more experienced woman might have told her, to be noticed by a man who notices everything as a matter of habit, the way a magistrate notices a face in a crowd, cataloging rather than admiring, and Wren told herself something very like that on the walk home, because it was the safer thing to believe, and safety, by then, had become such an ingrained habit of mind that she reached for it automatically, the way her hand reached for the tin wren whenever the day had gone hard. And yet, she found herself, over the following days, thinking of the exchange more often than the exchange itself seemed to warrant, turning the single dry sentence over the way one turns a smooth stone found on a beach. Not because the stone is valuable, but because the hand likes the shape of it, and she was irritated with herself for the thinking, and did it anyway, in the unguarded minutes before sleep and the unguarded minutes bent over her needlework, when her hands knew their work well enough to leave her mind free to wander somewhere it had not asked permission to go. Word reached Harwick Grange within the week, as word of anything involving the Duke of Alderley always did, that His Grace had been seen assisting some village mishap with his own hands, an anecdote repeated at cards with the particular relish the county reserved for any evidence that great men were occasionally capable of ordinary decency. And Wren listened to the story told secondhand across her aunt's drawing room, without once mentioning that she had been present for it, because mentioning it would have required explaining why the Duke of Alderley had troubled to say anything to her at all, and that was a question she did not yet have an answer she trusted enough to speak aloud. Seraphina, predictably, took a sudden and pointed interest in the state of the Alderley acquaintance, and began engineering with the transparent determination of a young woman who had never once in her life failed to get what she set her mind to. Opportunities for the family to be seen at whatever gathering His Grace might also be attending. And Constance, scenting a match with the particular keenness mothers of unmarried daughters reserve for dukes, encouraged the engineering with a warmth that made Wren, watching from the margins as she always watched, feel something she did not have a comfortable name for. Not quite jealousy, because she had no claim to be jealous of, but something adjacent to it. A small, cold awareness that, whatever brief, strange attention had been paid to her in a muddy lane, would very shortly be redirected, deliberately and with considerable skill, towards someone the county considered a far more suitable object for it. That was, after all, the settled order of things, and Wren had never once imagined herself outside it. A person does not spend 3 years being told, in 100 small ways, that she is a burden gratefully tolerated, without absorbing at least the outline of the lesson, however much the deeper, truer part of her resisted the absorbing. The invitation to the Alderley Midsummer Assembly arrived at Harwick Grange a fortnight later, addressed, as was proper, to Sir Aldous and Lady Harwick and family, and Constance spent the better part of 2 days in a state of barely contained triumph, ordering a new gown for Seraphina from the best modist in the county town at an expense Wren privately suspected the household could not entirely afford, and instructing Wren almost as an afterthought to see what could be done about freshening the grey wool for one more season's wear, since it would hardly do to spend good money on a companion's dress when the companion's chief use at such a gathering was simply to be present and unremarkable. Wren freshened the grey wool. She turned the hem, replaced the worn ribbon at the waist with a length salvaged from an old bonnet, and pressed the whole of it until it looked, if not new, then at least cared for, because there was a particular dignity in caring for what little one had that she was not willing to surrender, merely because no one else troubled to notice the difference. The evening of the assembly arrived clear and warm, the sort of long, golden midsummer evening the county liked to claim as proof of its own superior climate and Alderley court, when the Harwick carriage finally rolled up its long approach past clipped hedges and a lake gone copper in the setting sun, revealed itself to be exactly as imposing as its reputation had promised, and considerably less welcoming than its beauty suggested it ought to be. A great gray house that seemed, in the fading light, to be holding itself very carefully still. The way a person holds still who does not wish to be asked how he is truly feeling. Wren stood at the edge of the receiving line behind her aunt and cousin, feeling smaller than usual beneath the house's enormous shadow, and when the Duke greeted the Harwick party at the head of the stairs, his eyes moved past Seraphina's careful curtsy, past Constance's effusive gratitude for the invitation, and found, for the length of perhaps 2 seconds, the plain gray figure standing half a step behind them both, and something in his face, not warmth exactly, never anything so unguarded as warmth, but a kind of settled, private attentiveness, suggested he had been, in some small and entirely undeclared way, watching for her arrival specifically. He said nothing beyond the correct formal greeting due any guest, but his gaze lingered a half-second longer than courtesy strictly required, and Ren felt it land beneath her collarbone again exactly as it had in the ballroom a fortnight before, and she told herself, climbing the last of the steps into a house ablaze with candlelight and strangers, that it meant nothing at all, and did not entirely believe herself, and carried the not-quite belief with her like a second secret heirloom through the whole of the long evening that followed. The music at Alderley that night was better than anything Harwick Grange could have hired, and Wren spent the first hour of it exactly where she spent every ball, at the room's edge, watching other women be asked to dance, until the strange thing happened that would be repeated, whispered, and reshaped into a dozen different rumors by the following week. The Duke of Alderley, who had not danced with anyone at the last 3 assemblies the county could recall, crossed the length of his own ballroom during the second set and asked Wren Ashford, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and not 1 inch further, whether she would do him the honor. He did not ask Seraphina, who stood not 4 feet away in a gown of pale rose silk, her expression arranging itself, in the space of a single heartbeat, from certainty into something considerably less comfortable. He did not ask any of the 3 young women whose mothers had spent the better part of an hour maneuvering them into his eyeline. He asked the woman in gray wool standing near the terrace doors, and when Wren, startled enough to forget for a moment the careful stillness she had spent 3 years perfecting, glanced instinctively toward her aunt as though seeking permission she did not in fact require. The Duke said quietly that he had not asked Lady Harwick, and the correction, delivered without heat, without any performance of gallantry at all, landed in the small circle of listeners with the precise weight of a door closing. It was not admiration exactly, and it would have been foolish, Wren told herself even as she set her hand in his, to call it admiration, but it was not nothing either, and the nothing she had spent 3 years training herself to expect from rooms like this one had just, very publicly, failed to arrive. His hand at the small of her back was light and correct and entirely without presumption, the hold of a man who understood exactly how much liberty a dance permitted and took not 1 grain more, and they moved through the figures in near silence for the length of the first turn, until he said, in the same dry, unhurried voice he had used in the muddy lane a fortnight before, that he had noticed the hawthorn pattern along the hem of a certain gown some weeks previous, and had spent an inconvenient amount of time since wondering where a young lady of Wexmoor might have learned to render frost so precisely in silver thread, given that frost, in his experience, was a subject requiring either genuine study of a hedgerow in October or an unusual quantity of imagination. Wren's step did not falter, though something behind her ribs did. She said that she supposed some people simply had good imaginations. He said that he had met Miss Harwick's imagination on several occasions and had not, until that gown, found it extended much beyond the selection of ribbon. It was the driest thing she had ever heard a duke say about anyone, delivered with a face so entirely without expression that a stranger might have mistaken it for a compliment to her cousin, and Wren felt a laugh rise in her throat that she had to work, briefly and honestly, to suppress, because laughing at that particular joke in that particular ballroom would have told him everything he had clearly already half-guessed. She said only that she was glad the gown had given satisfaction to whoever had ultimately worn it. He said that satisfaction was not quite the word he would choose, and that he found himself considerably more interested in whoever had drawn the pattern than in whoever had worn the result, and there was a beat of silence after that in which neither of them said anything further. Because both of them understood, without either committing the understanding to words, exactly what had been admitted, and exactly what had not. It was not a confession. It was closer to an invoice quietly presented, and just as quietly acknowledged, a debt of credit noted, if not yet paid, and Ren carried the weight of it through the rest of the dance, with her spine very straight, and her face arranged into the same unreadable calm she wore for everything. Because a woman who had spent 3 years being underestimated learned early that the safest response to being finally, unexpectedly seen was not to celebrate it, but to guard it, the way one guards a small flame carried through wind. Constance Harwick did not dance that evening, having no occasion to, but she watched the whole of the exchange from beside the refreshment table with an expression that shifted over the course of 4 minutes, from polite interest to something considerably colder. And by the time the set ended and the Duke returned Ren to the edge of the room, with a bow correct in every particular. Ren's aunt had already begun, in the private arithmetic she conducted behind her pleasant public face, to recalculate the cost of keeping a plain, penniless niece under her roof against the newly visible risk that the niece might prove. Against every reasonable expectation, an asset the household could not afford to have competing with its actual daughter. It is a curious feature of certain hearts that they can love a child and resent her in the very same breath, provided the resentment is dressed cleverly enough to pass, even to the one feeling it, as concern. And Constance Harwick's heart, whatever its private confusions, had never once in 20 years failed to dress its resentments well. The carriage ride home was conducted in a silence Ren recognized immediately as the loud kind, the kind that meant a conversation was being composed rather than avoided, and it arrived, as she had known it would, the following morning, delivered over a breakfast Ren had not been permitted to sit down to. Constance informed her, without preamble and without quite meeting her eyes, that a letter had gone out that very morning to her late husband's cousin, a Mrs. Pruitt of Gravesmore, a widow of modest means and considerable ill temper, who had written more than once over the years inquiring whether the Harwicks might spare a companion, and that it had been decided, after careful consideration of what was owed to family in every direction, that Ren would do very well there, that the change of scene would benefit her, that Mrs. Pruitt kept an excellent household and would value a young woman of Ren's quiet, undemanding disposition. The word charity was not spoken aloud that morning, but it did not need to be. It sat in the room anyway, the way it always did, dressed now in the language of family duty and careful consideration. And Ren understood, listening to the careful, rehearsed cadence of her aunt's speech, that she was being removed not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had, for the length of one dance, done something inconveniently right. She did not argue. Arguing had never once, in 3 years, purchased her anything but a longer, more exhausting version of the same conversation, and she had learned that dignity in a house that did not value her, consisted chiefly of not begging for what would not be given. She said that she understood, and thanked her aunt for the years of shelter, and went upstairs to begin, with hands that were steadier than she felt entitled to, the small business of packing a life that fit, as it turned out, into a single trunk with room to spare. It is a particular kind of small death, to watch one's whole history folded into linen and closed beneath a lid, and no one in the house that morning remarked on it at all. The maids went about their work, the kitchen clattered on as it always clattered, and somewhere below her window Seraphina's voice rose in cheerful complaint about a torn flounce that would, of course, need mending before the week was out, by someone, though it was not clear to Ren, listening from above, that anyone had yet thought to ask who that someone would now be. She went down to the kitchen garden in the last of the afternoon light, because it was the one place in the house that had ever felt like hers, and knelt for a while among the beans she would not be there to harvest, and allowed herself, in that single unwitnessed hour, The whole of a grief she had not permitted herself upstairs. Not a collapse. Nothing so undignified as that. Only a long, quiet stillness with her hand pressed to the tin wren at her collar, and her mother's voice, unbidden, moving through her memory with its old, worn patience. A wren need not be a peacock. It had never before occurred to her to wonder what became of a wren when the hedge it nested in decided, for reasons of its own convenience, that it no longer had room. She was still kneeling there, dusk gathering blue and cool over the cabbages, when she heard the gate latch and looked up to find the Duke of Alderley standing at the edge of her garden with his hat in his hand and an expression that told her, before he had spoken a single word, that he already knew. He had come, he said, with a book he had promised to lend Sir Aldous, a plain enough errand that fooled no one, least of all Wren, who had learned to recognize a pretext when one stood in front of her holding it. He had learned of Mrs. Pruitt's letter from his own housekeeper, who had it from the Harwick housekeeper, who had it, in the manner of these things, from a kitchen maid who had overheard it directly. And he stood now at the edge of a vegetable garden in the fading light, with the particular stillness of a man who had walked a good distance to say something he had not entirely finished deciding how to phrase. He said that Gravesmore was, by every account he had ever heard, a cold house kept by a colder woman, and that he did not think it suited her. Wren said, evenly, that suitability was rarely consulted in these arrangements. He said that his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, had been complaining for the better part of a year that her correspondence had fallen into disgraceful arrears, that her eyes were no longer equal to fine needlework, and that she required, in his considered opinion, a companion of sense, discretion, and a steady hand with a needle, none of which qualities he had any particular difficulty locating. He said it plainly, almost gruffly, in the tone of a man discussing a household inventory rather than a rescue, and then he said the thing that Wren would carry, unaltered for the rest of her life, delivered without flourish, without a single ornamental word, as though he had rehearsed the plainness of it precisely, so that she would not be able to mistake it for pity. "I've got a spare room," he said. "It wants using. It is not charity, Miss Ashford. It is an offer of employment, honestly made, and you may refuse it exactly as freely as you would refuse any other." Something in the deliberate, unhurried denial of that single word undid a piece of Wren that 3 years of careful composure had never quite managed to protect. Because he had not needed to say it, he could have offered kindness dressed in any softer language, and she would have accepted it gratefully and gone on believing, privately, that she had been given alms. Instead, he had named the exact wound and then declined, on her behalf, to let it be inflicted again, and Wren felt her throat close around something that was not quite a sob and not quite relief, but some third, unnamed thing assembled out of both, and she looked down at the beans rather than at him, because she did not entirely trust her own face in that moment, and said, when she had found her voice again, that she would need to speak with her aunt. He said that he had already spoken with her aunt, and that Sir Aldous had raised no objection whatsoever to the arrangement, a fact delivered with the faintest dry edge that suggested Sir Aldous had in fact raised considerable relief, and Wren, hearing it, felt the last of her composure threaten seriously to give way. Not from grief this time, but from something almost unbearably lighter, and she pressed the back of her wrist briefly to her mouth, and did not, in the end, cry, though it was a near thing, near enough that the Duke, watching her with an attention he did not trouble to disguise, said nothing further for a long moment, only stood in the gathering dusk with his hat still in his hand, allowing her the dignity of recovering in her own time, which was, she would come to understand much later, its own kind of gift, rarer by far than the offer itself. She arrived at Alderley Court 8 days later with her single trunk and the tin wren pinned, as always, a little crooked at her collar, and was received not by a housekeeper's cool efficiency, but by the Dowager Duchess herself, a small, upright woman well past 70, with silver hair dressed with defiant precision and eyes so sharp they seemed to catalog a person's entire history in the time it took to curtsy, who took one look at Wren standing uncertain in the great hall and said, without preamble, that she had heard every particular of the business with the gown and the ring, and found the whole county's conduct in the matter a disgrace fit to be discussed at length over tea, which they would now proceed to have. It was, Wren would think many times in the weeks that followed, the first time in 9 years that an adult in a position of authority over her had simply believed her, entirely, before a single fact had been laid out in evidence, and the sensation of it was so unfamiliar that she found herself, over that first cup of tea, answering questions with a candor she had not offered anyone since her mother died, because the Dowager Duchess asked them not as tests, but as a woman genuinely curious about the answers, and curiosity, offered without an agenda attached, turned out to be a kindness Wren had very nearly forgotten existed. Her duties, once established, proved exactly as described and considerably more besides. The Dowager's correspondence, badly neglected, wanted sorting and answering in a clear hand. The household's mending, likewise neglected since the last companion's departure, wanted a needle that did not shake with age, and the estate's library, vast and half-catalogued, wanted someone with patience enough to sit for hours matching titles to a ledger no one had updated in a decade, a task that fell to Wren by accident one wet afternoon, and that she found, to her own private surprise, she loved without reservation. Because a library, unlike a drawing room, never once made her feel she had entered it on someone else's charity. It was in that library, 3 weeks into her residence, that the veiled duels properly began, because the Duke, it emerged, kept his own private hours there most evenings, reading or working through estate papers by lamplight long after the rest of the house had retired, and Wren's cataloging kept her there too, and the two of them settled, without either quite proposing it aloud, into a shared, wordless habit of occupying the same room at the same hour several evenings a week, exchanging perhaps a dozen sentences across the whole of an evening, and somehow, in the accumulation of those small exchanges, building something that felt considerably weightier than the sum of the words themselves. He asked her, one evening, why she persisted in cataloging the natural histories by author rather than by subject, since the previous system, however neglected, had organized them by subject, and she said that authors, unlike subjects, could not be reduced to a single category without doing them some violence, and he said, after a pause, that he supposed that was true of most things worth cataloging at all. And neither of them looked up from their respective work for the length of a full minute afterward, though something in the quality of the silence had shifted, warmed, the way a room warms almost imperceptibly once a fire has properly caught. He was not, she came to understand, an easy man, nor an especially talkative one, and the county's reputation for his exacting coldness was not, she suspected, entirely undeserved where lesser competence was concerned. She watched him dismiss a steward's careless accounting with 3 flat sentences that left the man visibly shaken, and watched, on another occasion, an ambitious young curate attempt to flatter him into a larger contribution to the parish roof and receive, in return, a silence so complete and so unimpressed that the curate abandoned the subject within the minute. But toward her, and toward the small kindnesses of the household generally, he showed a different face entirely, dry and understated and never once raised in volume, and Wren began, cautiously, to understand that his coldness was not an absence of feeling, but a very deliberate management of it. The discipline of a man who had learned, likely at some cost the household did not discuss above a whisper, that feeling loudly had once cost him something he was not prepared to risk again. She did not ask about the late Duchess. She had heard the story only in fragments, from a housekeeper who offered it reluctantly and only once, a young wife dead of a fever within 2 years of the marriage, a grief the Duke had apparently absorbed the way he absorbed everything, silently and entirely alone. And Wren found that the not asking cost her something. A small ache of curiosity she disciplined the way she disciplined every other unruly feeling, because a companion did not pry into the private histories of the family that employed her, whatever else she might privately wish to know. It was Lady Josephine Fairwood, the Duke's cousin on his mother's side, arriving for a fortnight's visit in high summer with a trunk full of scandalous novels and an even more scandalous willingness to say aloud whatever the rest of the household thought and did not voice. Who first named the thing neither Wren nor the Duke had yet permitted themselves to name. She found Wren in the library one rainy afternoon, sorting a crate of uncatalogued pamphlets, and settled herself on the library steps with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who had clearly already formed an opinion and merely wanted the pleasure of confirming it aloud, and said, without any preamble whatsoever, that she had known her cousin Julian for 26 years and had never once, in all that time, seen him linger in a room past the hour propriety strictly required unless the room contained something he was reluctant to leave, and that the library, prior to Wren's arrival, had been precisely the sort of room he abandoned by 9 each evening, without fail. Wren said that His Grace was simply a man of scholarly habits. Josie said that His Grace's scholarly habits had, by her own count, kept him in that library 4 evenings out of the last 7 until well past 11, and that scholarship, however admirable, did not typically produce the particular expression he wore when Wren entered a room, an expression Josie described, with the relish of a woman who enjoyed watching other people squirm exactly as much as she enjoyed being caught doing it herself, as the look of a man doing careful, private arithmetic he had not yet worked up the courage to show his sums on. Wren said nothing to that, because there was nothing safe to say, and Josie, watching the silence do its own quiet work, only smiled, gathered her novel, and left the library with the observation, tossed lightly over her shoulder as she went, that a woman could spend a great many years being careful and still, in the end, be exactly as seen as she deserved to be, which was either a comfort or a warning, and Wren, alone again among the pamphlets, was not entirely certain which. The comfort of Alderley, real as it was, did not extend so far as to erase the county entirely, and it was inevitable, given the size of Wexmoor's social circle, that the Harwicks and their circle would eventually cross paths with the household again, which they did at a garden party held at Alderley itself in late summer, ostensibly to celebrate the Dowager Duchess's birthday and, in practice, an occasion the Dowager had engineered specifically, Wren suspected, to display her new companion to the neighborhood in a setting where the neighborhood could not easily pretend not to notice her. Seraphina arrived in a new gown, sharper-eyed than Wren remembered her, and Lady Farrow arrived with her, the two of them moving through the party with the particular alertness of women conducting reconnaissance rather than enjoying an afternoon, and Wren, moving among the guests on an errand for the Dowager, felt their attention follow her the way a hawk's attention follows movement in tall grass, patient and entirely without warmth. It was 3 days after that garden party that the necklace went missing, a modest but genuine piece, a garnet and pearl collar that had belonged to the Duke's mother and was kept, ordinarily, in a locked case in the Dowager's own sitting room, discovered gone from its velvet the morning after a small evening gathering to which the Harwicks, among others, had been invited to dine. The household turned itself over within the hour, drawers searched, maids questioned. The dowager herself white-lipped with an anger Wren had not yet seen her direct at anything, and it was into the middle of that turmoil, 2 days later, that the letter arrived, unsigned, written in careful, deliberately disguised block capitals, addressed not to the Duke but to the Dowager Duchess directly, informing her Grace that she might wish to inquire more closely into the character of the young woman she had so generously taken into her household, a young woman who had, the letter noted with poisonous precision, been suspected of theft in her previous residence under circumstances that had been quietly hushed rather than properly investigated. A young woman whose sudden elevation from poor relation to trusted companion ought perhaps to prompt more scrutiny than gratitude had thus far permitted. The letter did not accuse Wren outright of taking the necklace. It did not need to. The implication sat in every carefully chosen phrase, close enough to accusation that the Dowager's own steward, reading it aloud at the Duke's request in the estate office, paled visibly before he had finished the second sentence. Wren, summoned to that office an hour later and shown the letter, felt the floor of the last 2 months tilt beneath her with a sickening, familiar lurch, because she recognized, instantly and with a dread that closed cold fingers around her spine, exactly what game was being played and exactly how badly it could end for her. A magistrate's inquiry into a servant's theft from a ducal household was not the sort of matter that concluded gently. Whatever the eventual truth of it, and a young woman without fortune, family influence, or a single independent witness to speak for her character stood to lose considerably more than a position. She stood to lose her liberty, her name, and any future at all beyond the one the county had already, in whispers, begun composing for her. The Duke's face, reading the letter over his grandmother's shoulder, had gone very still in the particular way Wren had come to recognize as his most dangerous stillness, the stillness that preceded, in stewards and curates alike, a reckoning delivered in 3 flat, devastating sentences. And when he looked up from the page, his eyes found Wren's across the office with an intensity that held. Nothing of doubt in it, nothing at all. Only a cold, focused fury directed entirely elsewhere, and he said, in a voice gone very quiet, that whoever had written this letter had made exactly one mistake, and that mistake would be found. Because letters, unlike whispers, could not later claim to have never been spoken. It was the Dowager Duchess who insisted on examining the letter herself, rather than surrendering it immediately to a magistrate, turning it over beneath the window's strongest light with the particular patience of a woman who had, in 70 years, developed considerable skill at detecting a lie dressed up as concern. And it was Wren, standing at her elbow at the Dowager's own quiet request, who saw it first, a small thing, barely worth noticing amid the deliberate, ugly slant of the disguised hand, a single capital S in the word suspected, curling back on itself in a distinctive double loop before continuing, a flourish Wren had seen 100 times before across 3 years of addressing invitations and correspondence at Harwick Grange. Because it was Seraphina's own particular habit, the one letter she had never quite managed to disguise even when she was pretending, as she so often did, to write in someone else's hand for the sport of it. Wren said nothing at first, only stood very still with her own hand pressed, unconsciously, to the tin wren at her collar, and the Dowager, watching her face rather than the letter, asked directly what she had seen, and Wren, drawing a breath that felt like the first honest one she had taken in days, said that she knew the hand, disguised though it was, because she had spent 3 years watching it form that exact letter at the top of 100 invitations, and that whoever had written the accusation against her had done so with the same pen that had. not 11 weeks earlier, signed Serafina Harwick's name to a gown Wren herself had made. "There it is," the dowager said, very softly, setting the letter down with the finality of a woman closing a ledger, and the room around them seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath along with her. The confession, when it came from Serafina 3 days later, arrived not from courage, but from cornering, delivered in the Alderley estate office before her own father, her own mother, and a magistrate summoned at the dowager's insistence, and it arrived in pieces, the way lies always came apart once the first thread was pulled, because the necklace itself was found within the hour. Sewn with clumsy, mismatched gray thread into the lining of Serafina's second-best reticule, a hiding place chosen in haste and stitched shut by hands that had never once, in all their years of claiming otherwise, learned to hold a needle properly. And Wren, asked by the magistrate to confirm the workmanship, needed only a single glance at the crooked, doubled stitches to say, with the flat, unadorned certainty of someone identifying a forged signature, that whoever had closed that seam had done so in the dark and in a hurry, and had never in her life finished a hem she had not paid another woman to finish for her. Serafina wept when the accusation could no longer be deflected, not from remorse so much as from the particular fury of a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was owed admiration and had discovered, in the space of one summer, that admiration earned by theft curdled the moment anyone troubled to look closely at it, she said, in a voice that cracked on every third word. That she had only meant to frighten Wren away, that the letter and the necklace had been Lady Pharaoh's idea more than her own, that she had never truly believed anyone would look closely enough to notice a stitch, and the last of that at least, Wren thought. Listening from the corner of the office, where she had once again taken up her old familiar post at the margin of a room, was probably the truest thing her cousin had said in years, because Serafina had built an entire life on the settled assumption that no one ever would look closely, and had never once accounted for what might happen if someone finally did. Sir Aldous, gray-faced and considerably diminished from the genial, oblivious man Wren had lived beside for 3 years, made what restitution honor required. A formal letter of apology delivered to the Dowager Duchess, a quiet word to the magistrate that ensured the matter proceeded no further than the walls of that office, and a summer spent, Wren later heard, in a chastened household where Constance no longer spoke of charity at all, having discovered that the word, once turned inside out by a magistrate's inquiry, revealed itself to have always meant something closer to leverage than to love. Lady Pharaoh's part in the affair, once whispered through the county's own efficient gossip network, cost her considerably more than the loss of 2 unmarried daughters' best prospects, a woman who traded in other people's ruin found, when her own hand in a genuine ruin was exposed, that the county she had spent years instructing in cruelty was perfectly willing to turn the same instrument on her, and she was seen at remarkably fewer gatherings for the remainder of that year, and at none at all the year following. It rained the night the last of it settled, a real storm rolling in off the moor by early evening and breaking properly by 10. The kind of storm the county would still be discussing at Michaelmas, rattling the tall windows of the Alderley Library where Wren sat, as she had sat most evenings of that long, strange summer, sorting the final crate of pamphlets by lamplight, while thunder walked slowly across the roof above her like something large and patient pacing. The Duke came in a little after 11, later than his usual hour, his coat still damp from having ridden out earlier to see a tenant's flooded field, and he stood for a moment just inside the doorway, watching her work in a way she felt before she saw, the particular weight of his attention that she had learned, over 3 months, to recognize with her back turned. He did not sit at his usual chair across the room. He crossed instead, slowly, unhurried, the whole long length of the library floor toward the table where she worked, and something in the deliberate, measured pace of it, one step and then a pause and then another, told her before he had spoken a single word that this was not going to be an evening of a dozen dry sentences exchanged across a comfortable distance. He stopped, finally, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to hold his eyes, and said that he had spent the whole of the ride home composing what he meant to say, and had arrived at his own stables with none of it in any order he trusted, and that he was going to say it plainly instead, because plainness, he had learned from her example, tended to survive better than anything more carefully built. Every evening I found a reason to remain in this room past the hour I had any real business remaining in it, he said, was an evening I told myself I had come for the pamphlets, and every one of those evenings I had come for you. Every letter I watched you answer in my grandmother's name, in that same careful, unhurried hand, was a letter I found myself reading twice, once for what it said, and once simply because you had shaped it. Every time you refused an easier kindness than the one I offered, every time you insisted on paying your own way through a debt no one else in your position would have troubled to acknowledge, I found myself admiring you more than was, by any reasonable account, wise for a man in my position to admire a companion in his own household. His voice, delivering all of it, had shed by degrees the flat, unhurried authority the county knew him by, until by the last sentence it had become simply the voice of a man, tired and rain-damp and entirely without armor, standing too close to a woman he had clearly decided, some time ago, he could no longer pretend not to want. Wren did not move. She felt the whole of it land somewhere beneath her ribs with a force that made her grateful to be sitting, and she felt, too, the old, well-worn instinct to make herself smaller, to deflect the moment with a dry remark and retreat back into the safe gray margin of the room, and she set that instinct aside, deliberately, the way one sets aside a familiar coat grown too small to wear any longer. She did not throw herself into the offered silence. She said, instead, in a voice she kept carefully level, that she had spent 3 years learning precisely what it cost a woman to be wanted conveniently, to be kept useful and grateful and quiet in exchange for a roof, and that she would not, having finally climbed free of that arithmetic, walk back into any version of it merely because the man offering it wore a better coat and a kinder face than the last one had. It was not a refusal. He understood that. She could see it settle in his eyes, and he did not flinch from the correction, only nodded once, slowly, and said that he had not come to offer her convenience, and that if she required him to say precisely why he wanted her, rather than simply that he did, he would say it as plainly as everything else he had said that night, because she had earned considerably better than vague sentiment dressed up as romance. It is not because you are useful to this household, he said, though you are, more useful in 3 months than the last 4 companions combined. And it is not because my grandmother has already, without my permission, begun referring to you as her granddaughter to anyone who will listen, though she has. And it is not because the county will find it a fitting, tidy story, the poor relation and the Duke, though I have no doubt it will make excellent gossip for a decade. It is because on the one evening this summer I dismissed the whole household early and sat in this room entirely alone, with no audience, no duty, and nothing at all to gain by it. I found that the room felt wrong without you in it, and I have not, since my wife died, allowed myself to notice that any room felt wrong for want of a particular person, and I find, having finally noticed it again, that I am not willing to pretend otherwise, simply because it is safer for both of us if I do. Wren felt the last of her careful composure give way at that, not into collapse, never into collapse, but into something warmer and more dangerous, a single unguarded breath that arrived unmistakably on the edge of tears she had not given herself permission to shed in longer than she could easily remember, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, the same old gesture. But this time she did not fight it fully back down. He did not reach for her. He only waited, standing very still in the lamplight with the storm working itself out overhead, giving her exactly as much room as she needed to arrive at her own answer in her own time. Because he had learned, watching her for 3 months, that the surest way to lose her would be to rush the one thing in her life she had never once been permitted to take slowly. When she finally spoke, her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not apologize for that, because there is a kind of dignity, she had come to understand, in allowing the truth to show exactly as much as it needs to show, and no more. She said that she would not answer him tonight with the whole of herself handed over unguarded, because she had spent too many years learning what it cost to hand herself over cheaply, but that she would answer him with this much, that if he meant what he had said, if he meant it not for one storm-lit evening, but for the whole ordinary, unglamorous run of days that would follow it, then she was not, in fact, unwilling. It was not surrender. It was closer to a door left open rather than a door thrown wide, and he understood the difference and respected it. And it was 3 weeks later, on a clear morning with the whole garden still silver from an overnight frost, that he asked her properly, in the walled kitchen garden she had, by then, quietly begun redesigning for the whole estate at his grandmother's enthusiastic instruction. Kneeling in the dew without the smallest concern for his own knees, and delivered the question the way he delivered everything that mattered to him, without ornament and without hedging. "I am not asking you because it would be convenient," he said, though it would. "The whole county has been composing our betrothal announcement for a month, regardless of my wishes in the matter. I am not asking you because my grandmother has informed me, twice this week alone, that she will not forgive me if I fail to. And I am not asking you because it would make a satisfying end to a story the neighborhood has clearly already decided to tell about us. I am asking you because I have discovered, watching you these last months, that I am most entirely myself in the rooms where you are, when no one else is watching to see it. And I find I do not wish to spend whatever years remain to me discovering that fact alone." Ren, kneeling now too, the frost soaking cold through the hem of a dress considerably finer than gray wool, but chosen, still, for its plainness over its fashion, said that she had spent 9 years being wanted for what she could quietly provide, and never once for simply being present. And that if he was asking her to marry a man who wanted her in the empty rooms as much as the full ones, then her answer was yes, and it was yes for the same reason he had just given her, because she wished it plainly and entirely, and had never once in her life been granted the safety to say so aloud before that morning. He took her hand then, ungloved, cold with frost, and did not let it go, not when they rose from the wet ground laughing at the state of both their knees, not when they walked back toward the house past a gardener who pretended very hard not to have seen anything at all, and the holding of it, unhurried and entirely unembarrassed, said considerably more to the household that watched from the windows than any announcement could have said. The wedding itself, held the following spring in the small stone church at the edge of the Alderley estate, was a quiet affair by the county's usual standards, though the county attended in force regardless, and Wren wore, beneath a gown of ivory silk she had, in the end, insisted on embroidering the hem of herself, the small tin wren pinned exactly as crookedly as it had always been pinned, because some things, she had told the Dowager Duchess with a firmness that brooked no argument, were not meant to be improved for the occasion, only honored as they were. It was a year and a half later, on a bright morning in early June, that the whole of Wexmoor gathered at Alderley for the formal opening of what the estate's tenants had already, informally, taken to calling the Duchess's Garden, a long-walled enclosure behind the old kitchen block that Wren had spent 18 months turning from neglected ground into a working physic and market garden. Planted with the herbs and vegetables and dye plants she had once grown alone behind a kitchen wall at Harwick Grange, with no audience but the cabbages, only now scaled to serve the whole estate, tended by a dozen village families who had been given, at Wren's quiet insistence and her husband's considerable financial backing, plots of their own within its walls. An arrangement several of the county's more established families had privately called an eccentric indulgence when it was first proposed, and had over 18 months of watching baskets of produce and jars of remedy leave those walls for households that had never before had enough of either, gradually stopped calling anything of the kind at all. The storm that had threatened all week broke hard the night before the opening, rain hammering the estate until nearly 3 a.m, and Wren had lain awake listening to it with the old familiar tightness of a woman braced for disaster, certain the garden's new plantings would be flattened before anyone had a chance to see them whole. And it was Julian, waking beside her sometime past 2, who had said, in the dry, unhurried voice she had come to love precisely because it so rarely lied to comfort her, that gardens which had survived worse than one June storm tended to survive this one too, and that she ought to trust the thing she had built with her own hands the way she had never quite learned to trust anything given to her by anyone else's. The morning arrived scrubbed and impossibly clear, the storm gone as completely as if it had never been, the walled garden beyond the kitchen block glittering with rainwater on every leaf, the roses along its south wall unbowed, the whole enclosure breathing out the particular sweetness of wet earth and crushed mint that Wren had long ago decided was the truest smell of anything she had ever built herself. The county arrived in numbers that surprised even the Dowager Duchess, tenants and gentry alike crowding the gravel path outside the garden's iron gate, children weaving between skirts and boots with the reckless energy of a proper holiday, and among the crowd, arrived at the Dowager's own deliberate, pointed invitation, stood Constance Harwick, considerably subdued from the woman she had once been, and Seraphina beside her, married the previous autumn to a solicitor of modest means in a neighboring county, a match that suited, by every account, her actual character rather better than the one she had once imagined for herself, and if there was an irony in the fact that both women stood now among the doubters converted. Neither Wren nor the narrator troubled to dwell on it aloud. Julian stood at the garden's gate as the crowd settled, Wren beside him in a plain green wool that suited the morning better than any silk could have, the tin wren at her collar catching the new sun, and when the crowd had quieted enough to hear him, he spoke without notes, in the same unornamented voice that had once told her, in a rain-damp library, that a room felt wrong without her in it. He said that 3 years ago, in a ballroom not unlike the ones most of them had stood in 100 times, he had watched a room full of people praise a piece of exquisite needlework and never once think to ask whose hands had actually made it, and that he counted himself, that evening, no wiser than the rest of them, only luckier, because he had happened to be standing close enough to notice the truth before it disappeared entirely into the county's comfortable, convenient forgetting. He said that this county, his own included, had spent years calling his wife a burden gratefully tolerated, a charity quietly extended, a poor relation to be pitied at a suitable distance, and that every one of those words had been wrong, entirely and demonstrably wrong, and he said it again, more plainly, because he wanted no one in that crowd to mistake the correction for politeness. They were wrong. She was never a burden. She was the quiet, steady labor behind half the beauty this county had spent years admiring without troubling to credit. She was the competence that mended what was broken before anyone else noticed it had broken at all. And she was, he said, his voice dropping into something considerably less formal, something that belonged more to the library than to the crowd. The reason he had rediscovered, after some years of believing himself finished with the discovering, that a house is not made a home by its size or its silver, but by who is glad to walk into a room simply because you are standing in it. He said that the garden behind him was not a gift from the House of Alderley to the tenants of Wexmoor. Whatever the county chose to call it, it was proof, planted in rows and tended by hands that had waited a long time to be trusted with something worth tending, that the people this county habitually overlooked had been worth believing in all along. And he hoped, he said, looking not at the crowd now, but at his wife, that whatever children this garden's walls eventually sheltered would grow up understanding that a person's worth was never once determined by the size of the inheritance behind her, only by the quality of what she chose, patiently and without an audience, to build. The applause that followed was not the polite, universal applause of a county performing gratitude for its own benefit. It came ragged and genuine from the tenant families first, spreading outward through the gentry with a warmth that surprised even those offering it. And somewhere near the back of the crowd, Wren caught sight of the Dowager Duchess dabbing openly at her eyes with a handkerchief and making not the slightest effort to disguise it. Wren did not speak to the crowd that morning. That had never been the shape of her, and Julian had known better than to ask it of her. But she allowed herself, standing at the gate of the garden she had built from a strip of neglected ground, with nothing but patience and her mother's old, steady conviction that small things done truly mattered more than large things done for show. One single unguarded moment, her eyes filling at last with the tears she had spent 3 years and considerably longer refusing to shed in front of anyone at all, and she did not hide her face from the crowd this time, because there was nothing left in that moment worth hiding. Only the plain truth surfacing at last after years of being pressed carefully back down, and Julian's hand found hers without either of them planning it, and closed around it, and did not let go. Exactly as it had not let go in a frost-silvered garden a year and a half before. She had spent 9 years believing, in the deep, unexamined part of herself that absorbs a lifetime of small diminishments and calls the absorbing simply being sensible, that she was ground rather than rain, a thing things happen to rather than a thing capable of making anything happen at all. And she understood now, watching a dozen village children run laughing between rows of mint and foxglove she had planted herself. Exactly how wrong that belief had always been. She had been worth believing in the whole time, worth it in the years no one troubled to look, worth it in the ballroom where her stitches went uncredited, and worth it in the pantry where she had stood alone with her hand pressed to a chipped tin bird and told herself, because there was no one else in the room to tell her, that she would endure it anyway. What had changed was not her worth. It was only, at last, the number of people willing to see it plainly and say so aloud. The marriage that followed the garden's opening and the years that followed the marriage were not, in any of the ways the county's more romantic gossips liked to imagine, perfect. Julian remained, in his private hours, a man of exacting standards who occasionally forgot that a household could be run with somewhat less precision than an estate ledger, and Wren remained, beneath the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting, a woman who still, on certain difficult evenings, had to remind herself deliberately that she was permitted to ask for help rather than simply provide it. It was not perfect. It was not, most days, especially easy. It was, simply, shared, built in the accumulation of 1,000 small, ordinary mornings, the way the garden itself had been built. One plot, one row, one patiently tended thing at a time. And that Wren had come to understand by the time the tin wren was pinned instead to the collar of a small daughter who bore, unmistakably, her grandmother's steady eyes, was more than enough. More than she had ever once dared to hope for in the years when hoping itself had felt like an indulgence she could not afford. The storm that had threatened the garden's opening never returned that week, and the dawn that followed it stretched on, clear and warm, well into the afternoon, the whole walled enclosure glittering with the particular light that comes only after rain, truthful and unhurried and entirely without artifice, and somewhere within it, hand still folded easily into her husband's as the crowd began at last to disperse toward the waiting tables of cider and bread. Wren Vane, Duchess of Alderley, stood exactly where she had once knelt alone among the cabbages of another woman's garden, and did not, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feel even the smallest need to make herself smaller for anyone standing near her.